A world-famous violinist walks into a hospital with nothing but his instrument. 5 minutes later, the entire pediatric wing is silent, eyes locked, tears falling. But one child isn't clapping. She's staring, as if she knows him, as if she's been waiting. What happens next will not only change André's life, but unlock something buried deep in the halls of that hospital, something nobody saw coming. André Rieu wasn't supposed to be in South Dakota. His tour schedule had him bound for Los Angeles, where 15,000 fans waited in the Walt Disney Concert Hall. But flight delays and a restless night in Rapid City left him wandering through the quiet downtown streets that chilly November morning, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. The hotel concierge had recommended a walk through Memorial Park, but André found himself drawn to the medical district instead. No entourage surrounded him. No media followed his steps. No security detail watched from black SUVs. Just André, his beloved Stradivarius violin case, and a growing sense of unease that had been building for weeks. He'd been touring for 8 months straight, sold-out venues from Carnegie Hall to the Sydney Opera House. Critics called it his finest work in decades. Audiences gave standing ovations before he'd played a single note, yet something felt hollow, as if he were performing behind glass, watching his own life from a distance. The Rapid City Children's Hospital appeared suddenly around a corner, its cheerful yellow exterior contrasting sharply with the grey morning sky. He wasn't looking for anything, just fresh air, just movement to quiet the restlessness in his chest. But then he saw her, a young nurse sitting alone on the front bench, her shoulders shaking with the kind of crying that only happens when someone too small, too young, faces something too big. André paused, violin case still in hand. The nurse wore scrubs decorated with cartoon elephants, her name tag reading Sarah. She looked barely out of college, probably new to the overwhelming reality of pediatric care. He'd seen that expression before, in the faces of musicians who'd lost their passion, in the eyes of students who'd discovered their limitations. Without thinking, he approached. "Excuse me, are you all right?" Sarah looked up, startled. Her eyes were red, mascara streaked. "Oh, yes, I'm fine. Sorry, I shouldn't be. Patients might see." "Sometimes we all need a moment," André said gently, sitting beside her on the bench. "I'm André. Sarah." She wiped her eyes with a tissue. "I know I should be stronger. The children need us to be strong. But sometimes—" She trailed off, looking back at the hospital entrance. Would it help to talk about it? Sarah studied his face, perhaps noting the kindness in his eyes, the genuine concern of a stranger willing to listen. "There's a little girl inside, Clover. She's been here 6 months and she's not getting better. Today the doctors said—" Sarah's voice broke again. "She asked me to find someone who could play violin. She said music was the only thing that didn't hurt anymore." André felt something shift inside him, a pull he couldn't explain. "I play violin." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "Really? Would you be willing? I know it's a strange request from a stranger, but I'd be honored." Inside, the hospital buzzed with the controlled chaos of healing. Nurses moved efficiently between rooms, their soft-soled shoes silent on the polished floors. The walls were painted in warm pastels, decorated with murals of forests and oceans, attempts to bring the outside world into these sterile corridors. No one recognized him at first. The receptionist, Kira, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, looked up as André approached with Sarah. "Kira, this is André," Sarah said. "He's a violinist. He'd like to play for Clover." Kira's expression softened. "That's very kind of you. Are you a volunteer with one of our music therapy programs?" André shook his head. "Just someone who happened to be walking by." "Well," Kira hesitated, glancing at the liability forms on her desk, "I suppose if Sarah vouches for you, the atrium might be best. More space, better acoustics." André opened his case in the hospital's central atrium, a 2-story space with a glass ceiling that let natural light filter down to the seating area below. A few early visitors sat reading magazines, their worried expressions temporarily replaced by curiosity as André lifted his violin. He'd played in some of the world's most prestigious venues, but something about this moment felt different, more intimate, more necessary. The first notes of a simple waltz filled the space. Not one of his famous pieces, but something tender, something that spoke of comfort rather than grandeur. Within minutes, the sound had drawn a small crowd. Nurses paused in doorways. Maintenance workers stopped their rounds. Parents emerged from patient rooms, some leading children who moved carefully with IV poles and wheelchairs. The music poured into the sterile corners of their lives like sunlight through storm clouds. André watched faces transform, worry lines softening, shoulders relaxing, children's eyes lighting up with wonder. An elderly woman in a robe wiped tears from her cheeks. A young father held his daughter closer as she clapped along to the rhythm. This was why he'd started playing, André remembered. Not for the sold-out stadiums or the critical acclaim, but for this, the moment when music reached directly into someone's heart and reminded them they weren't alone. He transitioned into Edelweiss, then a gentle piece by Pachelbel. The small audience swayed slightly, caught in the spell of melody. For 20 minutes the hospital became something else, not a place of illness and uncertainty, but a concert hall where hope had room to breathe. But the real story began as André played his third song, an original composition he called Morning Light. He noticed movement in his peripheral vision, a nurse wheeling someone into the back of the gathering crowd. She was small, perhaps 9 years old, with pale skin that seemed almost translucent under the fluorescent lights. An oxygen tube rested beneath her nose, connected to a portable tank mounted on her wheelchair. IV lines ran from her thin arm to a pole beside her, medications dripping steadily into her system. Her hair had been lost to treatment, but someone had placed a soft knitted cap over her head in a cheerful shade of purple. She didn't smile like the other children. She didn't clap when the song ended. She simply stared at André with grey eyes that seemed far older than her years, unblinking and intense. The applause faded, and André lowered his violin, offering a humble nod to his impromptu audience. Several people approached to thank him. Parents whose children had smiled for the first time in days, staff members who'd found a moment of peace in their demanding shifts. But André's attention remained fixed on the girl in the wheelchair. As the crowd began to disperse, the nurse, a tall woman with kind eyes named Patricia, wheeled her closer. "This is Clover," Patricia said softly. "She's the one who asked about the violin music." André knelt beside the wheelchair, bringing himself to Clover's eye level. "Hello, Clover. I'm André. Did you enjoy the music?" Clover tilted her head slightly, studying his face with an intensity that made André slightly uncomfortable. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but every word was crystal clear. "You came back, just like I told them you would." The word struck André like a physical blow. He blinked, certain he'd misheard. Around them, the remaining staff and visitors continued their quiet conversations, but André felt as if the world had suddenly narrowed to just him and this strange, serious child. "I'm sorry?" he asked gently, leaning closer. Clover nodded slowly, her grey eyes never leaving his face. "You said you'd return after the last waltz ended. In my dream. And you did." Her tone wasn't that of a child playing pretend or sharing a fantasy. It carried a certainty that sent a chill down André's spine. Patricia leaned over the wheelchair, her expression apologetic. "This is Clover," she explained again, as if the repetition might somehow normalize the situation. "She's been with us for 6 months now. She's special. Sometimes she says things that don't quite make sense to the rest of us, but she means no harm. The treatments can affect cognitive function sometimes." André studied Clover's face, searching for signs of confusion or medication-induced disorientation. Instead, he saw only clarity and a profound sadness that no child should carry. "Have we met before, Clover?" he asked carefully. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Not yet, but you will." The cryptic response sent another wave of unease through André. He'd worked with many children over the years. Students, young performers, kids in hospital settings like this one. But none had ever spoken with such strange confidence about things that couldn't possibly be true. Patricia adjusted Clover's blanket, tucking it more securely around her slight frame. "She's been asking about violin music since she arrived, said she knew someone would come to play for her eventually." Clover reached out with fingers so thin they seemed fragile as bird bones. "Play that song again, the one with the snow." André felt his breath catch. "I'm sorry?" "The song with the snow," Clover repeated patiently, "the one that sounds like winter ending." André's hands tightened on his violin. The last piece he'd played, Morning Light, was indeed about the end of winter, about snow melting and the first signs of spring. But that wasn't its original title. He'd written it years ago under a different name, The Snow Waltz. It was an unreleased composition, something he only played in private rehearsals or when he needed to work through difficult emotions. No one outside his inner circle knew that song existed, and certainly not a child in a South Dakota hospital. "How do you know that title?" André asked, his voice barely steady. Clover shrugged with the casual gesture of someone sharing obvious information. You wrote it for her, for the one you lost. The violin nearly slipped from André's grip. His face went pale, and he had to steady himself against the wheelchair. Patricia noticed his distress immediately. Are you all right, sir? You look like you've seen a ghost. André couldn't respond. The piece Clover referenced, The Snow Waltz, had been written in the aftermath of a tragedy he rarely spoke of, even to his closest friends and family. Decades ago, he'd mentored a young prodigy, a girl whose talent had burned bright and brief. Her passing had been sudden, unexpected, and had left André questioning everything about his role as a teacher and guide. The song was his way of processing that loss, of saying goodbye to potential unrealized. Only his most trusted colleagues had ever heard it, and even then he'd never shared the story behind its creation. I don't understand, André whispered. Clover's expression remained serene. You will. Patricia glanced between them, clearly puzzled by the exchange. Clover, honey, maybe Mr. André should play something else, something happier? No, Clover said firmly, though without any hint of petulance. He needs to play that one. It's important. André found himself nodding, though he couldn't explain why. His hands moved automatically, positioning the violin under his chin. As the first melancholy notes of The Snow Waltz filled the atrium, he watched Clover's face transform. Her eyes closed, and for the first time since he'd seen her, she truly looked like a child. Peaceful, unguarded, lost in something beautiful. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she was smiling. When the song ended, Clover opened her eyes and looked directly at André. Thank you. She heard it. André knelt beside her wheelchair again, his mind racing with questions. Clover, who are you talking about? Who heard it? But Clover had grown tired. Her eyes were heavy, and Patricia was already preparing to wheel her back to her room. Can I visit you again tomorrow? André asked impulsively. Clover nodded sleepily. You'll want to ask me about the blue room. André felt the blood drain from his face. Patricia didn't seem to catch the significance of the words, but André heard them like thunder. He hadn't heard that phrase in 40 years. That evening, André walked back to his hotel in a daze, his violin case feeling heavier than usual. The city streets seemed muted, as if his encounter with Clover had shifted something fundamental in his perception of reality. In his room, he sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his phone. He should call his manager, explain why he'd need to delay his next performance. He should reach out to his doctor, perhaps, to discuss stress and its effects on perception. He should do something rational, something that acknowledged the impossibility of what had happened. Instead, he found himself researching the hospital, trying to learn more about Clover. The staff had said she'd been there 6 months, arriving with no family, no background information beyond basic medical needs. A ward of the state, perhaps, or a child abandoned by relatives unable to cope with her condition. But that didn't explain how she knew about his music, his past, his carefully guarded secrets. At 3:12 a.m., as André lay awake staring at the ceiling, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The area code wasn't local. It looked European, possibly Austrian. The message contained only 5 words. Ask her about the blue room. André stared at the screen until his eyes burned. He checked the number twice, but there was no additional information, no sender identification, no way to call back. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning arrived grey and overcast, matching André's state of mind perfectly. He'd spent the sleepless hours researching everything he could find about childhood illness and its effects on cognition, looking for rational explanations for Clover's impossible knowledge. Hallucinations were common in certain conditions. Memory confusion could create false connections. Perhaps she'd overheard something or seen him perform somewhere before, but no theory adequately explained the specificity of her knowledge or the mysterious text message that had arrived in the darkest hours of the night. André returned to the hospital just after visiting hours began, carrying his violin case and a small bouquet of flowers he'd purchased from the gift shop. The same receptionist, Kira, greeted him with surprise and warmth. You came back. That's wonderful. Clover asked for you specifically this morning. She seemed so much brighter after your performance yesterday. How is she today? André asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Kira's expression softened with the practiced compassion of someone who delivered difficult news regularly. She has good days and challenging days. Today seems to be somewhere in between. Patricia is with her now. Room 247, second floor. The elevator ride felt longer than it should have. The second floor housed the hospital's pediatric oncology unit, its walls painted in gentle blues and greens. Volunteer artists had created murals of underwater scenes and forest landscapes, attempts to provide visual escapes from the reality of treatment and recovery. André passed rooms where children received chemotherapy, their young faces drawn but determined. He saw families gathered around bedsides, reading stories or playing quiet games. The contrast between the cheerful decor and the underlying sadness of the ward struck him powerfully. Room 247 was near the end of the hall. Through the partially open door, André could see Clover sitting up in bed, sketching in a large pad with colored pencils. Patricia sat nearby, helping organize the art supplies. André knocked gently on the door frame. "May I come in?" Clover looked up from her drawing, unsurprised to see him. "You came back," she said simply, as if his return had been inevitable. "I promised I would," André replied, though he couldn't remember making such a promise. Patricia smiled and gathered the art supplies. "I'll give you two some time to visit. Clover, remember what we talked about regarding rest periods." As Patricia left, André noticed that Clover had moved beyond simple sketches. Her drawing pad contained detailed, sophisticated artwork that seemed far beyond her years. Architectural spaces, musical instruments rendered with precision, faces drawn with an understanding of structure and shadow that suggested formal training. "You're quite an artist," André observed, taking the chair beside her bed. "I draw what I remember," Clover said, continuing to work on her current piece. "What are you drawing now?" Clover turned the pad toward him, and André felt the world tilt slightly. The drawing showed a room he recognized instantly. Ornate blue wallpaper with gold accents, tall windows with heavy velvet curtains, an antique music stand positioned in the center of the space. "The Blue Room," she said matter-of-factly, watching his reaction carefully. André gripped the arms of his chair. "Clover, how do you know about that place?" "It's where she waited," Clover replied, adding shading to one of the drawn windows. "The girl with the red ribbon in her hair." The details hit André like physical blows. Decades ago, during a winter tour through Salzburg, Austria, he'd been invited to perform at a private manor house outside the city. The manor belonged to Baroness Elisabeth von Waldmann, a reclusive woman whose daughter had been a remarkable violin prodigy. Elise von Waldmann had been 16, with dark hair always adorned with a red silk ribbon. She'd shown André her practice room, a hidden chamber on the manor's third floor, painted entirely in blue according to her grandmother's design. The room had become Elise's sanctuary, where she composed and practiced away from her mother's critical eye. André had spent a week at the manor, working with Elise on technique and performance preparation. Her talent had been extraordinary, a once-in-a-generation gift that promised a brilliant future. When he'd left Salzburg, André had intended to return within the month to continue her training and help arrange her debut with a major orchestra. But Elise had died before that return visit could happen. The official cause was listed as a weak heart, a congenital condition that had gone undiagnosed. But André had always carried guilt about leaving her behind, wondered if his presence might have made a difference somehow. "She told me you still blame yourself for leaving," Clover said softly, her pencil now idle. André's hands trembled. "I was supposed to take her with me, to Vienna. She was ready for the big stages, but her mother refused to let her go. I thought I could convince them if I gave them time to consider it." "She wasn't ready to leave then," Clover said with a certainty that unsettled André. "She had things to finish first." "What kind of things?" Clover set down her pencil and looked directly at him. "The music she was writing. The pieces that were meant for you." André felt tears threatening. In all his years of performing and teaching, he'd never found another student with Elise's combination of technical skill and emotional depth. Her loss had changed him, made him more cautious about forming deep connections with young musicians. "How can you possibly know about any of this?" André asked. "I've never told this story publicly. The von Waldmann family kept everything private after Elise passed. There are no records, no newspaper articles." Clover smiled sadly. "She found a way to tell me." Before André could ask what that meant, Clover reached into the drawer of her bedside table and withdrew something that made his breath catch. A sheet of music, handwritten in an elegant script he recognized immediately. "Where did you get that?" André whispered. "It was in my backpack when I came here," Clover said. "The nurses said I was clutching it when the social workers brought me to the hospital." André examined the manuscript with shaking hands. The paper was aged, yellowed around the edges, and the ink had the sepia tone of writing that had been done decades ago. The musical notation was complex, sophisticated, far beyond what most 16-year-olds could compose. At the top of the page, written in the same careful hand, was a title: Sonata for André, Movement 1. "This is impossible," André breathed. "Is it her writing?" Clover asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. André nodded numbly. He'd seen Elise's compositions during his week at the manor. Her musical handwriting was distinctive, with particular flourishes on the clefs and a unique way of spacing the notes that made her scores immediately recognizable. "Clover," André said carefully, "where did you live before you came to the hospital?" "I don't remember much before," Clover admitted. "Sometimes I have dreams that feel like memories, but they're mixed up. Different places, different times, but the music is always clear." "Have you tried to play this piece?" Clover's eyes lit up. "Would you like to hear it?" André was about to explain that she'd need a violin when Clover reached under her bed and pulled out a case he hadn't noticed before. Patricia had mentioned that Clover had arrived with an instrument, but seeing it brought a new wave of impossibility to an already surreal situation. The violin was beautiful, not a child's instrument, but a full-sized professional model with a rich, warm finish that spoke of quality and age. As Clover assembled it with practiced efficiency, André noticed details that made his pulse quicken. The chin rest was positioned exactly as Elise had preferred it. The strings were tuned to a slightly lower pitch than standard, another of Elise's quirks. And along the edge of the fingerboard, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, was a tiny carved initial. "E. That's her violin," André said in amazement. Clover nodded. She wanted you to hear the rest of the music. With careful movements that belied her condition, Clover positioned the violin and began to play. The first notes were tentative, but as she settled into the piece, something extraordinary happened. The melody that emerged wasn't just technically proficient, it was emotionally devastating. The composition seemed to tell a story of longing and loss, of potential unrealized but not forgotten. André recognized elements of Elise's style, the way she'd construct musical phrases that built emotion through subtle repetition and variation. But there was something else in the performance, something that suggested experiences beyond Clover's young years. She played with the weight of memory, the depth of feeling that usually came only with time and loss. When the piece ended, the hospital room felt charged with emotion. André realized he'd been crying without awareness, tears streaming down his cheeks as he listened to music that shouldn't exist, played by a child who couldn't possibly know its significance. "There are more movements," Clover said quietly, lowering the violin. "4 in total, but I can only remember them when it's time." "Time for what?" Clover's expression grew distant. "When you're ready to forgive yourself." That afternoon, André spoke with Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the hospital's head of pediatric oncology. Dr. Martinez was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and the efficient manner of someone who dealt with impossible situations daily. "Clover is a remarkable child," Dr. Martinez confirmed as they sat in her office overlooking the hospital's healing garden. "Her case is unusual in many ways beyond the medical aspects. What can you tell me about her background?" Dr. Martinez consulted Clover's file. "She was brought to us 6 months ago by social services, found living alone in an abandoned apartment building in Sioux Falls. No identification, no family records. The apartment was filled with sheet music and violin accessories, but no furniture or personal belongings. How was she surviving?" "That's one of the mysteries. The apartment had no electricity or running water, but Clover was clean, well-nourished, and showed no signs of neglect. She had extensive musical knowledge that suggested years of professional training, but no records of schooling or lessons." André absorbed this information slowly. "And her medical condition?" "Advanced leukemia, but responding well to treatment. What's unusual is that her blood work shows signs of previous chemotherapy treatments, but we have no records of prior care. It's as if she appeared from nowhere, already partially through a treatment protocol that doesn't match our current methods." "Is it possible she received treatment in another country?" Dr. Martinez shrugged. "Possible, but she speaks English like a native speaker, with a slight Midwestern accent. And some of the trace medications in her system aren't available outside the United States." André left the hospital that evening with more questions than answers. In his hotel room, he sat at the small desk and tried to make sense of everything he'd learned. Clover's impossible knowledge, the mysterious manuscript, the violin that had belonged to a girl who died 40 years ago. His phone buzzed with another message from the unknown number. "The Blue Room waits for both of you." This time André typed a response. "Who is this?" The reply came immediately. "Someone who remembers what others forget." André stared at the exchange for a long time, then made a decision that surprised him. He called his travel agent and asked about flights to Salzburg. It was time to return to the place where everything had started and ended. But first, he needed to understand more about Clover's connection to music that shouldn't exist. The next morning, he returned to the hospital with a specific request. "I'd like to hear the rest of the sonata," he told her. Clover smiled as if she'd been expecting this. "I was hoping you'd ask, but for the second movement we'll need to play together." "Together?" "She wrote it as a duet, for violin and violin. She said that's how you'd remember." André opened his own violin case with trembling hands. As he tuned his instrument, matching the slightly lower pitch of Clover's violin, he felt as if he were stepping across some invisible threshold. Whatever was happening here, whether delusion, coincidence, or something beyond rational explanation, he was committed to seeing it through. The duet that followed was unlike anything André had ever experienced. Two violins, separated by decades and impossible circumstances, playing music that bridged past and present in ways that defied understanding. And as the last notes faded, André heard something that made his heart stop. Applause, soft and distant, as if coming from somewhere very far away, or somewhere very long ago. The duet's final notes lingered in the air long after André and Clover had lowered their instruments. The hospital room felt different somehow, charged with an energy that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. André noticed that several staff members had gathered quietly in the hallway, drawn by the extraordinary music that had echoed through the pediatric wing. Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway, her expression a mixture of wonder and professional concern. "That was remarkable. But Clover, you know you need to conserve your energy for treatment." Clover nodded obediently, but her eyes remained fixed on André. "The second movement is finished now, but there's something else you need to see." She reached again into her bedside table, this time withdrawing a small leather-bound journal that André hadn't noticed before. The leather was worn smooth with age, and the brass clasp bore the initials EVW, Elise von Waldmann. "This was also in your backpack when you arrived?" André asked, though he suspected the answer would only deepen the mystery. "I've always had it," Clover said simply. "Read the entry for November 15th. André's hands shook as he opened the journal. The pages were filled with Elise's familiar handwriting, diary entries, musical notes, and sketches. He found the date Clover had specified, an entry written just days before Elise's passing. "My dearest teacher will return to me someday," the entry began. "I see it clearly now in the dreams that come between the medicine and the morning. He will find the music I've left for him, carried by a child who understands loss as deeply as I do. In the blue room where time holds its breath, the songs we never finished will finally find their voices." André looked up at Clover, who was watching him with those ancient, knowing eyes. "How is this possible? What does it say next?" Clover prompted gently. André continued reading, his voice barely above a whisper. "The girl who will carry my music hasn't been born yet, but she will know me as I know her, through the spaces between notes, the silence that gives music meaning. Tell André not to mourn what ended, but to celebrate what continues." The journal slipped from André's nerveless fingers. The impossibility of the situation crashed over him like a wave. Here was evidence written in Elise's hand that seemed to predict Clover's existence with impossible precision. Dr. Martinez stepped into the room, her medical training warring with what she'd witnessed. "Mr. Rieu, perhaps we should discuss this privately. Clover needs her rest and—" "No," Clover interrupted firmly. "He needs to understand before he goes back there." "Goes back where?" Dr. Martinez asked. "To Salzburg," Clover replied, though André hadn't mentioned his travel plans to anyone. "To the Blue Room." André studied Clover's face, searching for any sign that she was somehow reading his thoughts or making lucky guesses. Instead, he saw only compassion and a deep sadness that seemed to encompass more than her own situation. "You know I'm planning to go there," André said. Clover nodded. "She's been waiting for you to return. But you have to understand, time works differently in that room. What ended there never really finished." Dr. Martinez excused herself, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation's direction, but not before reminding Clover about her afternoon treatment schedule. When they were alone again, André leaned forward in his chair. "Clover, I need you to explain something to me. How can you know about events that happened before you were born? How can you play music that was never published, written by someone you could never have met?" Clover was quiet for a long moment, her small hands smoothing the covers of her bed. When she spoke, her voice carried a weariness that belonged to someone much older. Do you believe in souls, André? The question caught him off guard. I'm not sure. I believe in the power of music to touch something deeper than our conscious minds, but I've never been particularly religious. Not religious souls, Clover clarified. Musical souls. The part of a person that creates and understands beauty. André considered this. In his decades of performing, he'd encountered musicians who seemed to channel something beyond their technical training, artists who played with an emotional depth that transcended their life experiences. I suppose I've met performers who seem to access something universal through their music, he admitted. Clover smiled. Elise's musical soul was very strong enough that when her body failed, the music she still needed to create didn't disappear with her. You're saying her soul somehow transferred to you? Not transferred, Clover corrected. Shared. She found a way to place her unfinished music in a place where it could be completed. In me. The explanation was impossible, but no more impossible than everything else André had experienced since walking into the hospital. Why you specifically? Because I was already dying, Clover said with matter-of-fact acceptance that broke André's heart. My body was failing before I ever came here, just like hers did, but my musical soul was strong too, strong enough to carry both her songs and mine. André felt tears threatening again. Clover, it's okay, she said gently. I'm not afraid. The music makes the pain bearable, and knowing that Elise's compositions will finally be heard, that gives everything meaning. That evening, André researched everything he could find about the von Waldmann family and their Salzburg manor. Most records from that era had been lost during various political upheavals, but he found a few references in musical journals and society publications. The manor, he learned, had been abandoned shortly after Elise's passing. Baroness von Waldmann had never recovered from her daughter's loss and had moved to a convent in Bavaria, where she lived until her own death in the 1990s. The property had been tied up in legal disputes for decades, eventually falling under the protection of Austrian historical preservation laws. But more interesting were the rumors he found in online forums dedicated to Austrian folklore and unexplained phenomena. Multiple sources mentioned strange music heard emanating from the abandoned manor, particularly during winter months. Several paranormal investigators had attempted to record the sounds, but their equipment consistently malfunctioned when brought onto the property. Local police reports dating back 20 years showed repeated calls about disturbances at the manor, always music-related, always impossible to verify upon investigation. André booked a flight to Vienna for the following week. He would rent a car and drive to Salzburg, then find some way to access the manor and the Blue Room where Elise had spent her final days. But first, he wanted to hear the third movement of her sonata. When he returned to the hospital the next day, he found Clover much weaker than before. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and she moved with obvious effort. Dr. Martinez pulled him aside before he entered her room. Her condition has deteriorated significantly overnight, the doctor explained. We're adjusting her treatment protocol, but I want you to understand that these next few days are critical. André felt a crushing weight settle on his chest. How long does she have? It's difficult to say. She's a fighter, and children sometimes recover in ways that surprise us. But realistically, we're looking at weeks, possibly days. André entered Clover's room with a heavy heart. She was awake but lying flat, the violin case beside her bed clearly untouched since his last visit. You look sad, she observed with typical directness. Dr. Martinez told me about your condition. Clover nodded calmly. The third movement is the most beautiful one, but also the most difficult. It requires perfect timing. Maybe we should wait until you're feeling stronger. No, Clover said firmly, struggling to sit up. It has to be now, before the medicine makes it harder to remember. With André's help, she positioned herself against her pillows and took up her violin. The third movement began softly, almost tentatively, but quickly developed into something that transcended the limitations of the small hospital room. This piece was different from the others, more complex, more emotionally demanding. It told a story of acceptance and transformation, of finding peace within loss. As Clover played, André realized that this music couldn't have been written by a 16-year-old, no matter how talented. This was the work of someone who had faced their own mortality and found beauty in the journey. When the movement ended, Clover set down her violin with visible exhaustion. There's one more, the finale, but you have to play that one in the Blue Room. Why? Because that's where it begins and ends. That's where the circle closes. André spent the rest of the visit sitting quietly beside Clover's bed, holding her small hand and watching her sleep. The nurses came and went, adjusting medications and monitoring her condition, but André barely noticed their presence. He was beginning to understand that his connection to this extraordinary child went beyond coincidence or medical curiosity. Somehow, their meeting was part of a larger pattern, a musical composition that had been in progress for 40 years. That night, he received another message from the unknown number. The final movement waits, but some goodbyes happened twice. André stared at the cryptic text, then made a decision. He would move his flight up and leave for Austria immediately. If Clover was right about the timing, if the music truly needed to be completed in the Blue Room, then he couldn't afford to wait. But first, there was something he needed to do. The next morning, André arrived at the hospital before dawn, carrying his violin and a small digital recorder. Clover was awake, seeming to have been waiting for him despite the early hour. "You're leaving today," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, but I want to record the first 3 movements with you first, so the music isn't lost if something happens." Clover smiled weakly. "That's very practical of you." They spent the next hour performing Elise's sonata in its entirety, from the haunting first movement through the complex emotions of the third. The recording captured not just the notes, but the remarkable sense of collaboration between 2 musicians, separated by vast differences in age, experience, and origin. When they finished, Clover looked directly into André's eyes. "When you play the finale in the Blue Room, remember that endings are also beginnings." "What does that mean?" "You'll understand when you hear her voice." André kissed Clover's forehead gently, a gesture that felt both like a blessing and a goodbye. "I'll come back and tell you how the story ends." Clover's smile was radiant despite her weakness. "I already know how it ends, but thank you for helping it happen." As André left the hospital, violin case in hand and recorder safely tucked in his pocket, he carried with him the weight of responsibility for completing something that had begun decades before his birth and might continue long after his death. The Blue Room in Salzburg waited, holding secrets that only music could unlock. The flight to Vienna passed in a blur of restless anticipation. André stared out the airplane window at the clouds below, thinking about the impossible series of events that had led him to this moment. Beside him lay the digital recorder containing his duets with Clover, along with photocopies of Elise's journal entries. The journal revealed details about Elise's final days that official records had omitted. "The Blue Room has become a chamber where time holds its breath," one entry read. "André will understand when he returns. The songs we began together demand completion, even if we must find new ways to finish them." The rental car from Vienna was modest, but adequate for the mountain roads to Salzburg. The November sky threatened snow as André reached the city's outskirts. The road to the von Waldmann Manor remained largely unchanged, narrow and winding, climbing through dense forests. The manor appeared suddenly, its Gothic spires emerging from mist like something from a dark fairy tale. 40 years had not been kind to the property. Ivy covered the stone facade, several windows were boarded over, and the magnificent gardens had returned to wilderness. André squeezed through a gap in the chained gate and approached the building. The front doors were secured, but he remembered Elise showing him a servant's entrance. The smaller door was hidden beneath dead vines, but warped wood allowed him to force entry. Inside, dust and decades of neglect filled the air. André used his phone's flashlight to navigate servants' corridors toward the main staircase. Furniture remained under cloth coverings, creating ghostly silhouettes. Family portraits seemed to watch his movement through abandoned rooms. The third-floor hallway led to Elise's bedroom and the hidden Blue Room. André found the closet door and the brass panel that revealed a traditional lock. The key waited in Elise's music box, which still played Pachelbel's canon when opened. The Blue Room's door swung open silently, revealing a space untouched by time. While the rest of the manor showed abandonment, this room remained pristine, blue wallpaper unfaded, windows clean. The antique music stand positioned exactly as 40 years ago. André stepped inside and felt the air change. The room was warmer, with golden light that seemed filtered through amber glass. Most remarkably, fresh sheet music lay on the stand, clean pages in Elise's hand, ink still wet. Sonata for André, Movement 4 Finale, to be played where endings meet beginnings. André assembled his violin with trembling fingers. The room's acoustics seemed perfect as he began playing. The finale took on its own life, demanding emotional depths he hadn't accessed in decades. This was conversation between living and memory, between finished and unfinished. Halfway through, André heard a second violin in perfect harmony. He turned to see Elise materializing beside the window, 16 years old, dark hair with red ribbon, violin positioned perfectly. Together, they played the finale, two musicians separated by death and decades, finding perfect synchronization in the space between worlds. The final note resonated impossibly long. "Thank you," Elise whispered. "The music is complete now. The circle is closed." "I'm sorry I left you," André said through tears. "You didn't leave me. You carried me all along. Every performance, every student, I was there. And Clover, she's the bridge between what was and what will be. Her soul carries the music forward." As Elise faded, she spoke finally. "Tell them that endings are illusions. Music never truly dies. It only waits for new voices." André's phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Martinez. "Clover is asking for you. Her condition has stabilized unexpectedly." André packed his violin and left the blue room. The manor seemed more at peace now. Whatever had been unfinished was complete. As his plane lifted off from Vienna, André looked down at the Austrian landscape and felt closure he hadn't experienced in 40 years. The music was complete. The circle was closed. But new circles were about to begin. The flight back to Rapid City felt endless. Dr. Martinez's message had been urgent. Clover's condition had not only stabilized, but improved dramatically overnight, defying all medical expectations. She claimed to have received new music, the fifth movement of what she now called the Bridge Sonata. André landed and took a taxi directly to the hospital. Kira greeted him with excitement. "Thank goodness you're back. The most extraordinary thing has happened with Clover's recovery." Dr. Martinez intercepted him outside Clover's room. "Her recovery is medically inexplicable. White blood cell count normalized, tumors showing shrinkage or complete disappearance. The improvement began exactly when she said she dreamed of completing musical work with you." When André entered Clover's room, the transformation was immediate. She sat up naturally, skin showing healthy color, eyes sparkling with vitality. Most equipment had been removed. "You found her," Clover said simply. "I did. She was waiting in the blue room. I felt it when you played together. The completion changed everything." Clover gestured to her improved condition. Her bedside table held sheets of handwritten music, sophisticated composition, showing remarkable maturity. The Bridge Sonata isn't just Elise's story. It's about connection across time. The fifth movement is my contribution. André was struck by the composition's sophistication, not a child's work, but uniquely hers. They played the movement together, a dialogue between violins that told their entire story of loss, discovery, and resolution. "That's why I recovered," Clover explained. "When you completed Elise's work, it freed her spirit. When her musical soul found peace, mine could heal." Dr. Martinez entered with staff, drawn by the performance. "Everything is within normal ranges," she confirmed about Clover's latest tests. The remainder of André's visit was celebration and planning. The music therapy program wanted to document Clover's compositions. Social services had found her a foster family with musical background. "What will you do now?" André asked. "Learn. There's so much music I haven't heard yet. And you? Will you perform the Bridge Sonata?" André considered. The complete work represented unprecedented collaboration across time and death. "I think the world needs to hear this story." Elise would like that. She wanted her music to reach people who needed to understand that love doesn't end with death, it finds new forms. As André prepared to leave, he realized the encounter had changed him fundamentally. The restlessness was quiet, replaced by purpose beyond personal achievement. His phone buzzed with one final message from the unknown number. "The circle is complete. New circles await." André smiled, understanding that the messages had come from Elise herself, reaching across boundaries to ensure her music found its way home. 6 months later, André stood on Carnegie Hall's stage, preparing for what critics called the most anticipated classical performance of the decade. The Bridge Sonata would receive its world premiere tonight, performed as a duet between André and Clover, who had traveled from South Dakota. At 10 years old, Clover had grown stronger and more confident, her recovery inspiring families nationwide. The story had spread beyond classical music. Major outlets covered her recovery and Elise's lost compositions. The sold-out concert hall included audiences watching via live stream worldwide. Dr. Martinez and hospital staff occupied front-row seats. Representatives from music conservatories discussed scholarship opportunities for the remarkable young composer. Throughout the audience were other children, some in wheelchairs, some with visible treatment signs. André had insisted tickets be available to any family dealing with childhood illness. André spoke briefly to the hushed audience, explaining the composition's origins and extraordinary circumstances. He spoke of Elise, whose genius had survived across decades, and of Clover's courage in facing mortality. The first movement began with André alone, his violin singing Elise's haunting melody. Carnegie Hall's acoustics transformed the theme into something reaching every heart, preparing them for the emotional journey. When Clover joined the second movement, the audience gasped at her playing's maturity. This was an old soul speaking through young hands, channeling decades of understanding through remarkable gift. The third movement brought tears throughout the hall, music of acceptance and transformation from Elise's final days. The fourth movement soared with spiritual power that lifted the entire audience, but the fifth movement, Clover's contribution, created the evening's most profound impact. As violins wove all previous themes into something new, the audience experienced time collapsing, past and future existing in eternal present. The final note sustained impossibly long in perfect acoustics. When silence returned, the audience remained frozen, afraid applause might break the spell. The standing ovation continued over 10 minutes. Audience members wept openly, the music creating instant community among those united by shared vulnerability. After the concert, families approached wanting to meet Clover. Children fighting battles wanted to speak with someone who understood their journey. Parents found hope in beauty emerging from suffering. Dr. Martinez reported the hospital receiving calls about music therapy programs and violin lessons. "We found a way to make healing visible," Clover replied wisely. In following months, the Bridge Sonata became one of the most performed contemporary classical works worldwide. Clover thrived with her musical family, composing regularly about connections transcending circumstances. André returned to touring with transformed understanding of his performer role. Every concert began with sonata movements, emphasizing music as healing art. On their meeting's first anniversary, André and Clover returned to the hospital for a special concert in the same atrium where their story began. As they played, André reflected on the extraordinary journey, his guilt resolved, Elise's music completed and shared. Clover transformed from dying child into living bridge between past and future. In quiet moments, André still felt Elise's presence, peaceful, grateful, complete. Her musical soul had found the rest it had sought for 40 years. Somewhere in existence where time bends and music echoes forever, a girl with dark hair and red ribbon continues playing violin, knowing her songs finally found their way home to hearts that needed them most.